Associate with the Centre for Independent Studies. Her thoughts and articles on Aboriginal issues have been widely published. She also appears regularly on the ABC, Sky and other commercial channels. Earlier this year, Jacinta made an amazing personal submission to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights inquiry into freedom of speech in Australia, which explained how 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act encourages rather than discourages racism. Her professional roles include working as a cross-cultural consultant for almost 20 years. She is the founder and executive director of the not-for-profit Younger Peer Productions, which delivers a number of healthy living travelling musical productions to early childhood audiences in remote communities throughout Australia. She is deeply involved within her community as well as communities throughout the Northern Territory. Please welcome Jacinta Price.
Thank you and good afternoon. Well, as you all know, my name is Jacinta Numbagimba Price, and I'm an Australian woman who happens to have both Warrapari and Celtic heritage. Now, I was born in Darwin and I grew up in Alice Springs and spent a lot of time in the community of Yuendamu, which is 300 kilometres northwest of Alice Springs, where my mother was born. And I've spent a lot of my time over the years throughout my life as a visitor, but also through work in communities around the Northern Territory, South Australia and Western Australia as well. Now, I was going to speak on family violence in remote communities. However, I've already published several pieces and I campaign regularly to highlight the crisis. Some of you have seen so on my Facebook page that I seem to be addicted to at times. I think it's a bit worrying. However, instead I thought I'd address the topic of identity politics and its detrimental effect on the most marginalised Australians. The practitioners of identity politics demand attention on trivia and too often drag the spotlight away from the critical issues. The politically correct avoid the hard truths. I'd like to begin with my family's history. My maternal grandparents were born in the bush in Warrapari country. They grew up with none of what the UN declares to be the basic necessities of life around the world. They did not have readily available water or food. They did not wear any clothing or footwear, and they did not have a permanent roof over their heads. They didn't have beds, mattresses or blankets. They live each day surviving off the land and in one of the world's most harshest climates, where it can reach up to temperatures of 50 degrees in the middle of summer and minus 5 degrees on cold winter nights. And rainfall is erratic and scanty. Living on the flat desert plains, they found water by digging where the water table was quite close to the surface, or in times of drought, retreated to permanent rock holes along the ranges, and there weren't really many of those either. Men hunted larger prey and often had to walk for kilometres a day to do so, while women hunted smaller prey and gathered fruits and vegetables and seeds to grind into flour. We did not use animal skins for clothing, despite freezing cold winter nights. We would cook our prey in the skin to maximise the moisture and nutritional content of the meat. We had nothing to boil water in either. The drinking of kangaroo blood was important and ritualised. It was also thought to be beneficial for one's health, given what we know now about the high levels of iron found in kangaroo meat compared to other meats. Well, this makes sense. So life was very tough in the desert just 2 generations ago. And it wasn't until my grandparents reached their early adolescence did they come across white people for the first time. They were terrified and hid in the scrub as the whitefellas rode past on camels. It wasn't long before my grandfather's father was visiting Hermannsburg Mission for easy food and useful tools. Some of my grandfather's early experiences of whitefellas were very unpleasant. The infamous Coniston massacre began about 30 kilometres away from where he was hunting with his family. He was in his mid-teens at around this stage. and they fled in a great hurry to the reliable water sources in the ranges to the west, close to where he was born. The killers were not far behind for the first part of that headlong flight. However, within 3 years of those killings, he was working on Mount Doreen Station, right next to his birthplace. 10 years later, he was working with the army in Alice Springs with 1,000 other Aboriginal men. The white man had come to his country and he learned very quickly how to make a living from his presence. At one point in my grandfather's life, he had been chained around the neck and was marched with the Warrabri men from his country to the town of Alice Springs. I've learnt this only now, years after his passing, from his sister, who still to this day is with us to this day. But she can't tell us any more than that, and still doesn't know the reason behind why he was chained and marched. But there were many things I've learned from my grandfather about his life, but most positive. Despite the tough challenges, in his worldview, life was inevitably tough. Before the arrival of white people, conditions were harsh. One had to be utterly resilient to survive the environment, injury or sickness, without any modern treatments and medicines, and to survive tribal violence, which at times was extremely brutal. We know that my people were often at war with their neighbours to the north, northeast and west. Everybody lived in fear of stealthy attack by parties of avengers and sorcerers. So you would think that the intergenerational trauma would have ensured my victimisation, right? Considering all of this. The arrival of government and missions brought an end to most of the tribal warfare, but not all of it. Despite all of these challenges, my grandparents understood that the world was rapidly changing. Their survival instinct was to continue to adapt to change. The frontier violence in the eastern and southern states was longer lasting, sometimes more violent, and resulted in the loss of many languages and cultures and of all of their land. The frontier times last well into the 20th century in the NT and is much closer to us living now. The missionaries worked hard to protect our people from frontier violence, and our people recognise and appreciate that fact. Because of the Land Rights Act of 1976, my family have virtually all our land back. So we have a very different story. My grandparents' view was that whitefellas were another kind of human being and that they were here to stay. They brought a different way of life, and my grandparents had decided to understand it and engage in ways of becoming part of it. They worked all of their lives on the stations and settlements. They did not shy away from hard work. This is what they were brought up with. They made their children go to school regularly, and several of those became teachers. My mother's first job at the age of 15 was as a literacy worker in the school's bilingual program. They accepted much of the new, but tried to keep as much as they could of the old ways. My grandfather helped to build the Baptist church at Yuendamu, and around the time he helped also build the men's museum to hold sacred traditional objects. Now, identity politics plays a central role in every discussion of issues affecting Aboriginal Australia. Many Indigenous Australians speak English, live and work in cities, but identify only with the small minority of their ancestors. I am half Aboriginal and half Anglo-Celtic, and I live in a suburb. I'm proud of both sides of my heritage. I am 100% Australian, and proud of it. My first language is English. I speak Warrabri, not fluently, but I understand it, and I engage in conversation with my family in a combination of Warrabri and English. I've taken part in ceremony with my family, not a public display for tourists, but genuine ceremony for the continuation of Jukurba. We do not play yiraki, didgeridoo, or clapsticks as Warrabri people. We don't play didgeridoo, yiraki, because they belong to top-end people. My mother has taught me that. It would be wrong for us to use someone else's sacred instruments and pretend they are ours. As I mentioned in my commentary of Stan Grant's piece in the quarterly essay, he begins with, "Greetings to Gadigal's brothers and sisters." Well, this indicates the level of change which has taken place for a lot of Indigenous Australians in southern and eastern parts of Australia in comparison to us in the north. This greeting and the custom of addressing older people respectfully as auntie and uncle is a radical simplification of a complex kinship system. Warlpiri address each other by an exact kin term. We are all related in a particular way. We're not all just brothers and sisters. We do not use the terms auntie and uncle for anyone other than those who are in fact our auntie and uncle. Now, I understand that when other groups feel that they have lost language and culture, they will want to re-establish some form of ceremony and sacredness for themselves by forging a modern version of what they once had. This is happening the world over. I've got our Irish ancestry, and I know that what so many Australians now associate with Ireland was invented in New York and Boston not so long ago. My father was heartbroken, in fact, when he learned that When Irish Eyes Are Smiling was written by Americans and who weren't even of Irish descent, and the words to Danny Boy were written by an Englishman, in fact. But we do need to recognise the differences between all of the divergent groups of Aboriginal people in this country in order to tackle the complex problems that these people face now. The problem with the myth of unity, the idea that we're all the same people, is that the ones with the most to lose the most. Every group has the right to tell the world its own story in its own way, to take responsibility for their own problems, and if they are going to expect governments to give them the resources to solve those problems, to be accountable to the taxpayer for how they use them. Our community is made up of people who have one blood that goes back over 60,000 years. My mother and her family belong to this group. They live in remote communities, town camps, and in the suburbs in public housing. They are the most marginalised Australians of all. Then there are those of us who have one parent from this group as well as a non-Aboriginal parent, who may come from any of the ethnic groups now calling Australia home. Many have very mixed heritages. My sons have all the mixture of the British Isles as well as that of the great melting pot of Mauritius and, of course, Warlpiri. Well over 60% of those who identify as Indigenous have children with Australians who do not identify. Over 80% of their children identify as Indigenous. So we are getting further and further away from the traditional life, from the culture and biology of the First Peoples. And that's fine. We are proud of who we are, but we need to be honest about what is happening. Many who live in the suburbs alongside other Australians work in the many Aboriginal and government organisations, and increasingly, like me, are becoming business entrepreneurs. We don't have the same problems as my mother's people do. Early this year, I was invited to speak on a panel to address the Law Students Society's Social Justice Committee of ANU, with MLA Linda Burney and Asmi Wood, Senior Lecturer in Law. I spoke. I don't actually smoke. I spoke as a campaigner against family violence. I'd argued that traditional culture had to be taken into account when addressing underlying factors to family violence. Linda Burney scoffed at my claims that traditional culture played a significant role, and then continued to push the usual rhetoric about colonisation and dispossession. I stood by my claims that I know my language and culture and therefore had the right to speak on the issue. Burney, not surprisingly, then pulled the identity politics card and reminded the audience that Aboriginal people came in all shades of colours and backgrounds, and that not having language or culture does not make a person less Aboriginal. She did not understand that our country's most marginalised citizens are people of full descent. Their first language is not English, and their culture, or a dysfunctional version of it, is still intact. And that some of us, like she and I, are doing a hell of a lot better. So it is therefore our duty to recognise the underlying contributions of our culture to the perpetuation of family violence in order to find the real solutions to the problem. This is what is happening all over Australia. The gap isn't in between Indigenous Australia and non-Indigenous Australia. It is between the marginalised and the privileged, Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal. To me, Aboriginal people are those who I know who have no other ancestry other than Aboriginal, whose first language is not English. I learnt this from my Warlpiri family. My mother's people are honest. They use the words yappa, yapanyerni, karia, and yapagaji. Yappa is human being as opposed to non-human. Now it more commonly means Aboriginal. Yapanyerni means really Aboriginal or Aboriginal person of full descent. Yapagaji is the Warlpirized version of half-caste. It means person of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal descent. Karia means white fella. These terms are used about culture as well as race. So we often hear people saying things like Yappa way or Karia way. Because half-caste has been used in blatantly racist ways, and because the national debate is dominated by people of mixed descent who identify with only their Indigenous ancestors, it is considered by many in the coastal cities to be offensive and unacceptable. I am really proud of my mixed heritage, and I'm annoyed that there is no better simple English word available that applies to me. Yapagaji is not inherently pejorative. It refers to a biological fact. A person can be Yapagaji and fully, culturally and linguistically Warlpiri. They always recognise and celebrate kin relations between Yapanyerni and Yapagaji, and with Karia, like my father and my husband. So, Ngaituro Yapagaji. I am Yapagaji and proud. The political campaigns are run from the coastal cities. All political campaigns tolerate only one version of a story. City-based activists are much more interested in demonising white fellas than in solving problems. The only black deaths that matter to them are the ones caused by white fellas, and preferably in uniform. They have nothing to say about the deaths of Aboriginal women at the hands of their men. They are outraged by the rate of Indigenous incarceration, but have nothing to say about the fact that the great majority of Indigenous offenders incarcerated were convicted of major crimes of violence against their own people. Their version of the stolen generation will not tolerate the fact that the lives of some of these children, not all, were saved because they were taken away, and their descendants now run all of the organisations and the political agenda because of the education and jobs they received, while those that were not taken away are left behind in remote communities and town camps with very little education or meaningful access to the economy. My mother says that the urban activists have a Disneyland view of Aboriginal culture, so they cannot come up with an answer to the gross abuse and neglect of too many Aboriginal kids within their own communities and families. They have to blame white fellas rather than the actual perpetrators, and refuse to accept that those kids now need to be rescued from the culture of alcoholism and violence that they are caught in. The urban activists will use whatever means possible to shut down debate and stifle the expression of views they disagree with. They put much more effort into shutting down Aboriginal voices that don't conform to their agenda than to those of whitefellas. An invitation to my mother when she was an NT-MLA to speak to Indigenous students at Griffith University was withdrawn in 2013 because her views conflicted with those of too many of the staff and students. I and other Aboriginal people, like Anthony Dillon, Warren Mundine, whose views I share, are routinely vilified all over social media. I've received more than one death threat. In fact, I've received many. And the Greens have taken up this agenda. When Pilbara elders, desperate to end the epidemic of grog-fueled violence in their towns, went to Canberra to talk to politicians, well, the Greens couldn't even bring themselves to walk down the corridor to meet them. These people don't seek the truth. They perpetuate myths, like Aboriginal people are more likely to die in custody than non-Aboriginal people. In his book, Arresting Incarceration, Don Weatherburn, the Director of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics, reminds us that the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody revealed that Aboriginal people were no more likely to die in custody than non-Aboriginal people. The higher rate of Aboriginal deaths in custody was almost entirely explained to the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody. He debunks the myth that higher rates of incarceration of Aboriginal people are due to racial bias within the system. He writes, once crucial sentencing factors are held constant, especially current and past offending, sentencing outcomes for Indigenous and non-Indigenous offenders either achieve parity or the gap is evidence to suggest that Indigenous defendants are at times treated leniently in comparison with their non-Indigenous counterparts. In our experience, this is most likely to happen when both the perpetrator and victim of violent crime are Aboriginal. It is important to understand the level of complexity of all this when dealing with Aboriginal issues, and also the way in which policies are created and funding is distributed. We have seen a rapid increase in the number of people who now claim Aboriginality. They are an extraordinarily diverse group. If we collected statistics on the basis of first language rather than on the basis of claimed ethnicity, then it would be much more obvious where the biggest problems are. However, the most pressing need is to give dissenting voices from within Aboriginal communities the chance to be heard. This applies mostly to the voices of the most marginalised, the women and children. But it also applies to those most courageous of our men who are sick and tired of visiting hospitals and jails to meet up with family members, both victims and perpetrators, and who are sick of burying our children. We want to keep our women and our kids out of hospitals and our young men out of jails and everybody out of premature graves. We won't be able to do that without hearing the cries for help and ignoring the ideologically driven nonsense from those who refuse to see the truth and who don't suffer the problems. Identity politics is a distraction from the critical issues. Identity politics does not solve problems or save lives. Identity politics drives wedges between us and instead of uniting us for a stronger Australia. Those suffering in remote communities are not concerned with how proud a Warrabri or how proud a Bittinjara or how proud a Lurja they are. They are simply trying to exist in the world, and simply existing, in my view, is not good enough, as they should be free like the rest of us to thrive and flourish as proud Australians. I want to end with a quote from an Aboriginal man, Waverley Stanley from Queensland. "We may not agree on everything, but we can agree on this," he said. "There's no black and white in my eyes, even though we come from different backgrounds. It's just a love story about two people coming together with a united goal to make a difference. Identity politics aims at dividing us. That's why it only creates and doesn't solve problems. We will only start to solve the big problems if we are prepared to do it together."